this is what APEX offers us in terms of JavaScript APIs. In my opinion, it's a bit difficult to understand. It's a lot here. It's not as easy to consume as the PL/SQL APIs that everyone's used to. So that's why I thought there is a need for such a talk to put some structure in this mess. Anyway, so a quick word on FOX, plugins, many plugins, region types, item types, dynamic things. Why should we even care about JavaScript in APEX in the first place? That's the question. You can build a perfectly scalable, secure, good-looking application with PL/SQL only, right? Or even without any code at all. If you just use the building components, do some toggling on and off, you have an application that works. But with JavaScript, you bring a little more to your application. So you can build more dynamic apps. As an example for this, you know, a typical workflow of an APEX app, you load the page, you fill in something, you submit the whole page, everything reloads. It's just this monotonous sort of life cycle. If you're willing to write some JavaScript, you can start making use of AJAX calls. So only send the data and fetch the data that you need. Don't reload the whole thing. Improve user experience. So, for example, say a user is filling in some form and they have a wrong value in one of the items. They don't have to wait till they submit the whole form to get an error message. We can maybe show them as they're typing, hey, you have an error here, this number is not allowed to be negative or something. Right now we can only do that with JavaScript. For when dynamic actions are not enough, take this typical dynamic action as an example. So the problem I always have is you cannot actually catch, say if an error happens, instead of execute PL/SQL code, you cannot actually catch that error. Dynamic action wide. So no error handling. If you need something like this, you have to convert all of these dynamic actions to JavaScript. Also, you notice there's only one level of branching. You can have a client-side condition, and you end up either in the true actions or in the false actions. That's it. There's only one level of branching. If you need more, again, you have to convert it to JavaScript. Leverage already existing functionality. So as we can see, there's a lot here. My favorite example is the grid widget. Look at just how much stuff APEX offers us. This is for the interactive grid. We can do so much. It's just that it's not exposed to us through the dynamic actions. So this is everything that APEX offers us declaratively, but we know just by this one single widget that there's so much more out there that we can control. So if you want to make use of these things, and you don't find in here what you need, you will have to write JavaScript. Another point, JavaScript will only keep growing. So I think this was meant to be HTML and CSS instead of CSS. So I took this screenshot from one of Mike Hitchwa's talks, I think last year at APEX Arcadia, and I think it was meant for 19.1. The metric here is lines of code, not always the best metric, but it's a metric. And we see that inside of APEX, JavaScript has the majority on lines of code. And the way it looks, that will only keep growing with the more dynamic, widgety type things that we're gonna get, like the interactive grid. That side of things will only keep growing. So it makes sense to pay attention to this space. Also with things like MLE coming soon, with the multilingual engine, we can run JavaScript inside the database, right? Is that bad? Am I not supposed to?
It's just not soon.
Yeah.
Soon is relative.
Right. So another reason to keep an eye out for it. Word of caution, as always, when recommending to people that they should be using JavaScript, you don't have to, right? JavaScript, although it brings all these benefits, it does imply, for example, longer development. It takes more time to write the code than to just toggle some things on and off. Longer maintenance, in case, let's say you upgrade, some JavaScript API changes, you'll have to go in and fix all of that. Statistically speaking, you will have more bugs in your application. More code, more bugs. We have to live with that. That being said, however, if we're careful and if we don't go crazy and write hundreds of lines inside of a single execute JavaScript code dynamic action, if we keep it to less than that, if we store our JavaScript in files, so if we don't just throw it everywhere on the page, also if we only use the provided APIs, these ones right here, we should be fine with JavaScript, right? So there's a certain balance we have to achieve. All right, so what kind of APIs does APEX actually offer us? So we have this one right here with the awesome shortcut that I love. That's the one we'll be focusing on most, but that's not the only official API for APEX things. The universal theme has some JavaScript in it, so if you go to the universal theme, reference JavaScript API, they have a couple of JavaScript functions in there. For example, for toggling, I think the side menu on and off dynamically, if you need to toggle it, or you can catch some events. So there's some more code in there. Also, APEX itself integrates other components. For example, the charts, they are jet charts. The calendar, I think that's some jQuery UI component. And the rich text editor is the actual CK editor. So all of these components come from different places, and they have APIs outside of APEX. So if you want to do something with the rich text editor to make it more fancy, you have to go to the CK editor website to check their documentation and then adapt it. So many places for APIs, but we'll stick with the official JavaScript API. If we now look in here, so once you go to this webpage, it's not going to look the same on your computer. Who here has been on this page before? All right. Okay, so it's not going to look like this. You won't have these color things. I just added them with a browser extension to kind of group things together because you can really get lost. For example, everything in blue is related to the interactive grid. They could have put it all in one place, but they spread it out. So if you're not interested in interactive grid things, you don't have to pay attention to the blue items. Right, so we can see we have three main parts. We have the widgets, we have namespaces, we have interfaces. We also have the non-namespace APIs that I blurred out because actually we shouldn't be looking in here. These are functions that are kind of polluting the global namespace. With each new APEX release, some of these become deprecated. So as a rule of thumb, don't use anything from here. There's a reason why they don't deserve a place in a specific namespace or something. So that leaves us with widgets, namespaces, and interfaces. So what's what? Naturally, I'm going to start with number 2 because it's the easiest one to explain. That's this stuff right here. APEX, APEX actions, DA, debug, event, item, group. These could be compared to PL/SQL packages. So we can just say apex.message.showSuccessMessage or something. It's that simple. So they are an object that contain other functions and other objects and options and so on. The only thing is they're nested in JavaScript. So Apex contain all of these namespaces. Apex.message might contain another namespace. In PL/SQL, you cannot really nest your packages. They are basically utility functions that are grouped together by purpose and scope. So let's say in Apex, Apex server, you're going to find everything related to client-server communication. If you want to contact the server, that's where you would look. In Apex message, that's the one with the notifications. Everything concerning pop-up notifications are there. Tiny note here, Apex Apex item and Apex region are actually functions themselves. let's get into this a bit later. So, demo. What do we have here? I'm not gonna go through all of them due to lack of time, but some of them could be interesting. So I have this demo app here. Let's try Apex Lang. So I have these little code editors here that I can just execute. Imagine this code running in a dynamic action execute JavaScript code, or running in some file, or wherever JavaScript can run. In this case, it's just for displaying purposes. So Apex message allows us to show such messages dynamically. We don't have to submit the page and provide a success message in the process section. We can do it dynamically. This helps a lot, for example, if you have an execute PL SQL code dynamic action, it comes back, but we want to tell the user, hey, whatever you did went okay. We want to show a success message. That's why we have a second dynamic action, which is execute JavaScript code with this code in it. So, it should work. I'm in the wrong namespace. Apex messages is what I was talking about. So, Apex message, show a success. In order to get rid of it, if you want to dismiss it, just Apex message, hide page success. Now it's gone. An interesting use case could be, you know how after a process the page reloads and you have a success message. Some people say it's a bit annoying that the success message just always sticks up there and you have to dismiss it manually. You could run this piece of code on page load on page 0, for example. So after 3 seconds, after clicking this button, the message is gone. So this could run on page load every time. If there's a message there, it's going to disappear. If there's no message, it's okay. Something more interesting is show errors. And this is a bit cumbersome to read, but you can pass an array of objects to this show errors function. And they are, let me just quickly show you what so I'm talking about such errors and such errors. Let's clear them. It expects such a JSON object. Type error is always the same. Where do you want to show this error? Do you want to show it on page or in line with a specific field? So in this case, the first error will show both on page and in line. If it's in line, you must specify which item it's in line with, and also the error message. Unsave, actually this should also always be true. And then we show a second error message that's just on page with this error message. So let's execute it again. We will see that name is required is up here, but also it's in line with this page item, right? And our second one, page error has occurred, is only on page, so it's up here. As opposed to the success messages, which get overwritten every time you run the show success message call, error messages end up in a queue or in a stack. So if I keep executing this, you're just gonna keep getting more and more error messages. What you do is clear the errors. So every time before doing this, you probably want to clear already existing errors and then show your errors. Why is this interesting? Why should we bother with this? So it's a pretty simple example. I'm not going to take you through the code, but you can build something like live validation on a form. So let's say I'm not allowed to put in the employee name, I'm not allowed to put special characters. So this is all good, and then I type this in. It says, hey, the name must not contain special characters. Also disabling this button right here. It's a bit of a more visual cue for the user. They don't have to wait till they submit the page to know that something is wrong. Also for numbers, you can have something like, hey, this is not a valid number, or no, the salary must be between these two numbers, right? So much more dynamic pages. I wouldn't suggest you implement something like this on every form that you have in your application, but if you have one major thing that's very commonly used, it would be worth the time to invest the time and make it a bit more user-friendly. So alert, if you use the alert dynamic action in Apex, it looks something like this. It's got this old alert way of showing things, but in the API, they do it a bit differently. So if you run Apex message alert, you get this type of alert message that's a bit more in line with the universal theme. So it's prettier, it doesn't block the JavaScript threads. It's recommended that you do this and not the alert dynamic action. Confirm, same thing. The basic confirm dynamic action is like this, but if you're willing to write 5 lines of code, you could have something like this. I do not know why that's not native as a dynamic action in Apex, but we have a plugin coming out soon which will have all of these things as declarative. So that was the Apex message namespace. It's probably the namespace I use most. It's in all of my apps, on most of my pages. I think it's just very, very useful. So, what should we look at next? Apex lang is also interesting. Peter mentioned the Apex lang PL/SQL package, but there's also sort of a sibling namespace in JavaScript. Nope. Take for example this case. I have some code and I show a success message. This message is in English. What if we translate the application? If you go through the traditional translating process, you're going to translate labels and things like that, but hard-coded values in, for example, JavaScript code won't get translated. So even if you switch to a different language in your app, you will still get the English message. What you do though is you can go to shared components, text messages, define your text message identified by this ID in all of your languages, and make sure this little toggle is on so that this data gets passed to the client. Then then our code becomes something like this. We get the message by that ID and we show the success message. So executing this, it's in English, okay. Let's switch our application to German. And I have to refresh my cache real quick. So now we're in German, and the very same code shows a different language message. Very useful, pretty simple and straightforward, the Apex lang namespace. Apex server, let's have a look at Apex server. It's not the best example I could come up with, but when you pass page items back and forth, you have a character limit, right? We know that the values that page items can hold only go up to 4,000 characters, right? What happens if you want to communicate between the client and the server something larger than 4,000 characters? We're gonna have to use some code in that case. So we can use Apex server process, which can send and get back data of pretty much any size. In this case, I provide here, so this has a accompanying PL/SQL callback defined on the page somewhere here. So you can have this piece of code under the Ajax callback display point, and you can send back data via this cool Apex JSON package. But anyway, so what this does is I provide a number, and the server is going to generate me, let's say, 10 random characters. 10 is not so bad. We could have done that with the execute PL/SQL code dynamic action. Let's say we want 10,000 random characters from our server. We can get that. Yeah, so here you're going to need the name of your process. which page items you want to submit. So in this case, I submit this value. The process reads it, does some computing, whatever your business case is, and sends back the data. And this data we just set to this item. Right? So if you need to pass larger data sets between client and server, have a look at this namespace, Apex server. Apex debug, that's also pretty interesting, but what else is here? Apex util. Let's try something. I don't have an example for this, but I guess we can try it live in here. This has nothing to do with Apex server process anymore, but let's see. A cool little function is apex util dot show spinner. It shows a little spinner. You might need that for whatever. If you have a longer running process, PL/SQL process, you might want to tell the user that something's going on if it takes a longer time. So you show a spinner, do your PL/SQL, remove the spinner when the PL/SQL is done.
You can set a timer?
You can, if you're willing to write the code for it, you can set a timer. Let's try that. Let's try that real quick. I think it's window.spinner. So we must keep a reference to whatever it is this thing returns, and then set timeout function, something like this. Window.spinner dot remove, and this should fire in 5 seconds. I hope this works. Show a spinner, and after 5 seconds, maybe it's gone. Yep. So you can do such things with it. Right. So this was the easy stuff, unfortunately. But most times you're only ever going to use the namespaces right here. There's a lot of stuff in there. I suggest you spend maybe a couple hours sometime and just look through it. You will learn a bunch of things. Let's move on to the not so fun stuff, the interfaces. These are a bit more difficult to explain because here we just said, hey, Apex util show spinner, right? Well, you cannot say item dot disable. These are not so easy to work with. Interfaces an interface is something that you implement. For example, every item implements its own item interface. So in order to use the functions and things that you see under the interfaces section, you must first get a reference to that certain implementation. So for example, Apex item get value or set value, that's a pretty commonly used one. Well, you're not going to find the implementation for get value, set value under Apex item. Here we only see create, that's something for plugin developers, it's not interesting. What we want is to get a reference to the implementation of the item interface. So, I hope my internet is still on. That's how we get that interface. So we say Apex item, item name, and that function, how I said Apex item is actually a function as well as a namespace as well as Apex region. There are just 2 exceptions. They will return us
a handler.
Yes, so they will return us like this object that has all of these functions on it that we can see inside of the interfaces section. So we can say, hey, set value, or we can say get value. We can also use get value. And then we can set the value again and x plus x. John, that should give us John back. Yes. So get value, set value. It's just an interesting thing how you don't actually find these items these functions where you would expect them to. You have to look a bit and get into the actual interface. Same thing for a region. If you want to refresh a report in JavaScript, you would not go to apex.region.refresh. You would go to apex.region and then the region ID, and that gives us an implementation of this interface, the region interface, where we see a refresh function. So this is just the current time, the sys_state or something. This should just refresh us that. So that's how you would do this programmatically. For refreshing, we have a built-in dynamic action for this. You wouldn't usually have to do this, but for more complex requirements, you might have to use this. So just to go through all of these 7 interfaces and how to get these objects, actions. I explain this. Actions are right now something only for the interactive grid. If you're not interested in tweaking the interactive grid, forget about actions. HTML builder is something that only Apex uses internally from what I've seen. You can use it, but I haven't seen anyone do it. But that's how you would get that interface, interactive grid view, again, item, that's the commonly used one. The model, again, something very interactive grid specific. Region, another commonly used one. And the tree node adapter is something for trees. If you want to influence your Apex trees, you would do something like this. Yeah, so not quite straightforward. Item and region are the important ones here. Okay, I guess we've done the demo. Okay, so just a side note, from what you've seen, a lot of this stuff is not really meant for the typical developer to use. So don't get intimidated by how things look, and just pick the ones that are of interest to you. Compared to the PL/SQL APIs, which are sort of written and documented as meant for a broad use, this is a bit of a more nerdy, different structure. So the widgets. All of these things here are actually only controlling 3 Apex components. A tree, the Apex tree, the Apex menu, that's a pop-up menu if you've seen them anywhere, and the interactive grid. If you don't want to control any of these 3 with JavaScript, don't look at the widgets. Right, so another level of abstraction here would be that if you want to call a method, for example, on an interactive grid, and you say, hey, I want to say focus, a simple method. Despite how it looks, you would not just say dot focus, like you would call a normal function in any normal programming language. These widgets are implemented as jQuery UI widgets, and things look a little bit different there. So this right here is how you would call a jQuery UI function. You say .call and then the function name. And in terms of options, you don't just say .option name equals true or .false or to get it or to set it, but you have to say .call option and then option name to get it, or .call option, option name, and then the new option value to set that option. Yeah, same for menus. Not so straightforward to work with, is my point. A quick demo about widgets. Let's start with the tree view. A bit of info. So we've all seen Apex trees. They're not very interesting. And in terms of the control that we have on them through dynamic actions, we really only have expand all nodes and collapse all nodes. So these are some dynamic actions that work on trees. That's not very exciting, which is why trees are not really that widespread, I would say. But if you're willing to write some code like this and maintain it, and research on how on earth to do it, you could get something like this. So the tree actually is a good widget, and it has a lot of functionality. They're just not exposed to us by default. So we can actually go ahead and enable inline editing. Meanwhile, this is not available in a regular tree because it's just, we don't have an interface to that. You could enable drag and drop inside of your tree. You could also enable context menus in your tree. Again, this is not there declaratively, you will have to write the code for it. So if you ever have this requirement, look into the tree view widget. I think it's pretty. Another widget would be the menu. So, imagine this code running on page load, let's say. So we execute it to simulate that. And also this menu button has some HTML attributes on top. So I declared these inside of the builder. And now once this is executed, and if the button is configured correctly, this button actually becomes a such a pop-up menu thing. Again, you can do this without writing code, but that would involve the list solution. So the way it is recommended or demoed, I think, in the Universal Theme sample app, they use lists. That's a bit more cumbersome to work with, I find. And you can also not really trigger JavaScript code. You can only navigate to other pages. So if you go this route and you implement this programmatically, you can actually trigger JavaScript code on click of those buttons and actually do something more interesting than just redirect somewhere else. If you want to go crazy, you can not only have such buttons, you can also have separators, you can have submenus, you can have toggles, you can have radio groups, and that looks something like this. So we execute this code, and we get something like this. So submenus, separators, this is a toggle, so I click on it, disabled then becomes enabled, enabled, disabled, or radio groups. So again, this is not available to us out of the box. We'll have to write the code for it, but at least we have an API that offers us that, and it's a supported API. Hopefully we won't have to change any code when the new version comes. Menu bar example, you can also make menu bars, something like this. They're not as cool. They do not really support separators or icons, and also I never could really get them to work. So I wouldn't recommend doing this. But it is there, in case maybe you manage to get it to work. So now let's talk about reference API, real estate all over the place. That's the interactive grid. All of this blue content is only here to allow us to control the interactive grid. So for example, if you simply want to add a button to the interactive grid toolbar, or refresh only the selected rows and not the whole grid, we don't have a declarative way to do this. We will have to write JavaScript. And unfortunately, JavaScript on the interactive grid can be a bit of a mess. That's the bad news. The good news is that we can build something pretty cool with it. We'll just have to suffer a little bit in the beginning. So, how on earth are all of these things combined? Well, luckily, we have this beautiful diagram by John Snyders. He's the creator of the interactive grid, the mastermind behind this big component. I haven't really seen this diagram anywhere else. I just found it in one of his blogs from 2016. But actually, if you really want to understand how this component is built, you will need this diagram. So I'll take you step by step through it. Let's say we want to change the rows per page dynamically, right? Maybe you have a select list somewhere, you say I only want 5 or 10 or 100 rows per page. We want that dynamically. We don't want to submit the page or anything. And we go in here and we say, hey, this little grid widget, it has this rows per page option. This is something I can use, right? So you click on it, it says, this is how you set it. It's actually not that simple. And they don't really explain that. You must first get to the reference of this grid widget. So you must dig down through all of these components to end up right here. but step by step. First, we get the big region up top. We say apex.region, and then the region ID. And that's gonna be our region. In API terms, we're gonna use apex.region, the function, not the namespace, that will give us an instance of this region, of this interface. So from here, we can use the call method. So we say region.call, get views, because the interactive view can have icon view, it can have detail view, it can have chart view. Usually when we think of the grid, we just think of that particular grid widget, which is under the grid view and single row view widget. So what are these get views grid things? So from here we can say use the call function, which actually takes us back up here, and we can use these methods. So here we use get view, I think, get views, and which view do you want? Do you want the icon view or the traditional grid view? We want the grid view, so we give that as a second parameter. But what this actually gives us back, this grid view, is actually, let's go back again, it's an instance of this interface. So it's a bit cumbersome, but it's gonna make some sense at the end. And from here, we can access this property. So we can say .view, and that will finally give us this grid widget on which we can call rows per page. So in this case, I'm calling select all to select all records. But you see how we had to kind of transverse the whole component to really get to that point in the API that we really need. You can combine all of these commands to have just one long command, but this I just showed you for step-by-step purposes. So in reality, how would this look? Let's say we have this code here. Again, same things. This is an interactive grid right here. It has a static ID of emp. We get the view by doing this step, and then we get the widget by doing this step, and then we can actually use the options. So rows per page. I don't want, how many is it here? I think 10 rows per page. Let's say 100. I want to see all of my employees. Execute. Oh, suspicious. Very suspicious. Okay, let's try that again. Let's say rows per page, I only want to have 4. Okay, it seemed to work. So that changes it dynamically. Let's say, what was this one? Select all. Let's say we want to select all of the rows on page load for whatever reason. But this is not an option. This is a method. And then we say select all, and then we also don't need this. So select all of the rows are selected. In reality, you wouldn't do this step by step. You would have something like this. Let's get rid of this. Grid select all. Only one command, which when we run it, is going to select us all of the records. But just so you know, there is an explanation on why we need to call this entire thing in order to perform our call. Not ideal. They could have provided some syntactic sugar for it. They didn't so far, but if you need this functionality, you can get it. It's just a bit tricky to get there. Right. Sorry, it just got more and more abstract as we went on, but yeah, it's very useful stuff, not that straightforward. Really, I only understood all of these different sections when I was preparing for this very talk. I thought I knew it, but then I realized I did not get it. So yeah, there is a learning curve, but then you can end up building much more interesting behavior in your app. Again, use JavaScript with caution. You don't want to have it break on the next upgrade, and we also don't want to move away from the low-code-ness of Apex so much, because that's why we like it. We should just use a little bit here and there, that's all. Again, explore for yourself. There's a lot of things that I didn't get into that you would probably find more interesting. But just go through the API and you'll find lots of interesting things there. That's it. Thank you.